I am here running a little late, but not nearly as late as your handouts. I just got word that they will show up next week. So, my goodness, I don't know what happened. There they are. You know, you run them off on the copy machine. Evidently, we really ran them off. They ran off somewhere. I don't know. Forgive me for that. We will give it to you next week. If you all joining online, really grateful to hear from people who are watching this online. We're trying to put the church phone number and Galilee's email so you can reach out if you want the handout. You might get it the first among anyone. Email is info@galileeumc.org. Today in the GreatReligions course, we're talking about Confucianism. And I confess, let me just give you this disclaimer, as I often do. I'm no expert. In fact, among the 10 or so religions we're going to talk about, I probably know the least of this one. And I know you're disappointed right from the start because I'm learning right along with you. So it's good practice for me to do a lot of research and then just share with you. But when we get to the Q&A, I might have already told you everything I know. But I hope you're okay with a teacher who is also a learner, right? I mean, we're all disciples. A disciple is a learner. And so I'm learning right along with you. Although I can understand your disappointment, like I've heard from some of you who are like, I don't want to go to a doctor who has a practice. Do you know what I mean? He's just practicing. I want him to be ready to do it for real. Anyway, so I'm just practicing, just learning right along with you. But let's get into this for real. Confucianism. Now, I've heard from a number of you, so if it's any one of you, I'm not thinking of just you. There are people who walk in on Sunday morning, for example, who say, you know, I've been listening to your GreatReligions courses, but wait a minute, why do we need to know this stuff? You know, and it's interesting because as most of us Christians, right, as Christians, we probably know very little about other traditions or other religions, unless maybe we've traveled overseas or lived overseas or have a family member or perhaps have come from a background of other religions. But let me just tell you again why I think this is so important as people who happen to be Christians. Well, I know that as we learn, we deepen our understanding. As we learn about something different from our own tradition, it helps to deepen our understanding of others, extend compassion towards others, have a little more patience with people when we understand them better, right? Hopefully, I think it promotes peace, that the more we seek to understand others, it helps with peace in our community and hopefully around the world. Now, here's my secret plan, though. Should I share my secret plan with you? I'm going to do it. All right. At the end of this class, as we get to the final session, I hope we can put it all together, that as Christians, we can better understand what we believe, all right? So we can hear the congruence with other faiths, particularly wisdom traditions. Our Old Testament has a lot of wisdom tradition in it. But here's the thing. When we put it all together and understand better why we think the way we think, it also helps because loving your neighbor begins with understanding your neighbor. So I think it helps us to actually live our faith better. But that's just my secret plan. You may have your own agenda. You may have other things that you get out of this. But I want you to know there's a bigger picture and not to lose sight of that. Today, I'm going to talk about Confucius. And believe me, there is not a whole lot, the story of his life and so on and so forth. When we were talking about Buddha, that was a man, had a kind of an amazing story and everything. And I'm not saying Confucius isn't amazing, but there's not as much story. I'm a person who is very attuned to stories. Our faith tradition involves a lot of stories. I would suggest just at the beginning for you to understand as I present this, that it's Confucius has a lot of wisdom sayings. If you read the Christian Bible, it might be like saying it's the book of Proverbs, or in the Apocrypha, there's the wisdom of Solomon. So there's a lot of sayings like that and attributed to Confucius. But listen, it's the impactful religion that followed his life that made the biggest difference. Confucius is known as the first teacher, not that he was chronologically first in China, by no means, but that he is of primary importance, first importance and influence, the greatest influence of all the teachers. He came about, born around the same time as Siddhartha Gautama from the Buddhist tradition. the Buddha. So around that time of 550 BC in China. Today, the number of adherents that's listed, the followers of Confucianism, is only around 6 million officially. Okay, that's a fairly small number for us to talk about a great world religion, but it is the most influential religion in the world's largest nation of China, and has been so for 2,000, almost 2,500 years. So that's very significant. Again, let me name the name is Confucius, which is a Latinization. Of course, by the time we get it into English, a lot of things influenced by Latin. But could also say Confuzi, literally meaning Master Kong, was his name. And I'm going to list a couple of sacred texts. These will be on your handout when I give you the handout next week, sorry. The sacred texts that I would name, and there are a few more, but let's just keep it simple. The 5 classics, which these are the core of Confucianism, but they actually predate Confucius. He certainly was the editor, collecting the ancient wisdoms and putting it together for posterity. But when I think about the sacred texts, again, they're not stories like we might have in Hinduism and certainly in Christianity, but these are like wisdom sayings or proverbs. It's a collection, the 5 classics, a collection of Eastern wisdom tradition. Now, the other one, and you might find this on the bookshelf at your local Barnes & Noble or what have you, the Analects. The Analects of Confucius are the actual sayings of Confucius. These texts may be brief compared to what we consider sacred texts in our tradition or in others, but it's really the religion that follows these texts and that follows the teachings of Confucius over the centuries, compiled and expanded and influential in government and in the education of Chinese. Well, this is a religion, by the way, that is not focused on a God, but rather on human action, activities, and relationships. Sacred places or temples are likewise dedicated to humans and not deities. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of background. Let me dive into it, particularly Confucius himself and his teachings more deeply now. I would put a little caveat there at that last statement, because some of you have asked this question. Yes, like Buddhism, many consider Confucianism not to be a religion. And that's not wrong, okay? You can think it's a philosophy or a way of life because there's no deities. You could imagine they are agnostic. I might not say atheistic, but rather agnostic, meaning it doesn't matter whether God exists. Not trying to outright disbelieve God. And in many ways, the religion has become very open to God or trusts in a higher power or heaven, and you'll hear a little bit about that. But it is okay to say it may not be a religion. The reason why we do is say we respect the millions of people, and of course over 1 billion people in China who've been affected or influenced positively by these teachings of Confucius. And it certainly has come to be a religion in that regard. Now, he taught many ethical practices to benefit society. That's the main thing about Confucius. He's a teacher teaching ethical practices for the benefit of society. One most notable teaching is ancestor veneration. And that's just kind of been part of the Eastern culture, part of Chinese culture all along, going back to really the mists of time, right? And that sort of teaching continues to influence China. Understand the context. He was born 500 years before Christ. There were problems in Chinese society that Confucius set out to solve. All right. Primarily, the problem in his day was violence, a recurring theme in religion, because violence is a recurring theme in humanity, right? The story of people is a story that's often punctuated by war, unrest, and violence. If you've walked with me through any of my talks on Old Testament books, particularly Genesis, you might recall it's plainly stated in our faith tradition that God does not condone violence. And in fact, the violence that's included in sacred scriptures, and even the case in the Hindu scriptures, is to show what not to do. Don't do this, right? but wherever people are, they tend toward violence at some point. And perhaps this is why religions, and certainly all the religions we're going to cover, promote peace. It's all about trying to work with people to find peace and harmony, and that was Confucius' goal as well. I'm mindful that, one of the things I got from my dad, God rest his soul, tomorrow would have been his 97th birthday, is a love for reading and a love for stories. And one of his favorite storytellers was the Western author Louis L'Amour, if anybody's heard of that. And I was just reading one of these books where the main character, last name Sackett, comes over from the England area. He's on the ship. He comes over, and his first experience with Native Americans, one befriends him and one's trying to kill him. And so his friend says, "Why are they trying to kill us?" Which is pretty common human question. The experience of violence and why. And we ask that question, don't we? Why are people so angry? Why can't they get along? Why are they trying to kill us? And Barnabas Sackett's salient answer is simply, we're strangers. Right? I mean, isn't it just kind of deep in the human psyche that somebody who's outside of our inward group, our group, tribe, whatever you want to call it, if they're different from us, then there's this tendency towards rejection, fear, reactivity, yes, violence. So Confucius was noticing this. This was definitely on the rise in his time. The order of the empire was breaking apart. Barons, large landowning clans, would be in conflict with others. It was very bloody, mass executions. Whole groups were captured, beheaded, including women, children, and the aged. There were accounts of mass slaughters of 60,000, 80,000 or more. It was a very violent time in Chinese society. Fear and chaos were common experiences for ordinary people every day. Also, in addition to the violence point, in Confucius' time, the long-standing tradition of continuity with one's ancestors was already breaking down. And we're talking about 2,500 years ago. I mean, we hear about people talking about that sort of issue in our day and time, but it was happening in China. It happens everywhere in human cultures over time. But this idea of tradition notwithstanding the current circumstances, the tradition of the elders, particularly, I think for me, I'll say, as a modern North American person of a certain background, it's hard for me to simply understand what a veneration of one's ancestors looks like. But if you're from China or from Asia, if you have more of an Eastern mindset, you can understand it's just ingrained in you to be very respectful of older generations. And that's just a start to understand it. It's much deeper than that. There's sort of this overarching social custom of tradition, and that if you're not doing that, you really are breaking the rules. And of course, for me, I know in my time, my culture, we venerate what is new, right? Don't we always want the latest and the newest, and we applaud innovation and so on. So just think the opposite of what we might normally appreciate. And that's what was breaking down. What was needed was this continuity of tradition, this very deep respect for relationships, particularly people who are older. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But I'm trying to give you a context here. This was a time when people were first starting to think more individualistically. Not nearly what we have since the Enlightenment, but this is a part of that time in China, 500 years before Christ was born, that people thought less about their community and started to think, what's in it for me? What's in it for me? Rather than merely doing things the way they've always been done. So there became a problem with social anarchy. For me, I echo back to the Old Testament book of Judges. It says, at that time there was no king in the land, and everybody did what was right in their own eyes. Can you imagine a people that would just do what they thought was right? That every person was like a little queen or a little king, their own authority. It's hard to imagine sometimes. And you can read the newspaper. Listen to, in that context, listen to the characteristics of Confucius the teacher. Because, more than anything, he was a teacher. When you want to just make some distinctions, again, I'm not trying to do comparative religions. We want to just make some distinctions. between some religious leaders or founders of religions. What you could say about Confucius is not so much that he was religious or had some sort of esoteric, very spiritualized, deep meditation practice. No, just a really, really effective teacher of wisdom. So he was an itinerant teacher, very supportive of promoting education for the common person. Personal ethics was what he shared as well. And for a time, he served in government until the jealousy of his rivals eventually forced him out of office. Can you imagine politics like that? Anyway, later in life, he developed a number of disciples who spent time writing down his teachings. That happens in a lot of religions, including Christianity, right? He served then more as a mentor to others and to other government officials. He died really having lived a long, full life, 73 years of age, around the year 49 BC. 479 BC. Born around 551, lived to 479. Anyway, you can do the math. I'm just getting the numbers wrong. We need that handout. Okay, so what is more important to note is that during his lifetime, he was a relatively minor figure on the stage of China's history. So what happened? How did he become so famous? Well, his students began to write these commentaries on his teachings, and these became the most popular throughout China and, of course, enduring to this day. And the era, in that time, Chinese people had many different deities, like local religions or folk religion, if you don't mind that term. I mean it with deep respect. He saw no need for this, which for me just reminds me of the Buddha in that story that we learned from, India's traditional religion of Hinduism. And the Buddha thought, just too many deities. We don't need all that. Let's break it down to its essentials. And so Confucius rather cultivated wisdom, and we might use the term humanism. Okay, so person-focused, person-centered, if you will. It was his followers who later added rituals, some of them did, to his teachings that resemble more like we would call religion. So it's grown more influential over time. Now, one other thing I think is an important characteristic, don't miss this. He developed a very democratic view towards people in a time of rigid formality. He was accessible, even affable, ready to champion the cause of the commoner over against the nobility, to lift up personal relationships and reach across class lines. So there's wisdom right there. I'm going to use a phrase, all good things. So as someone else who's not a Confucius person goes and looks at, I just see a lot of wonderful wisdom. And I'm going to share some of that with you. There's not a lot dramatic. I mean, I keep looking for, and that's just my preference, I guess. I keep looking for stories or something that really kind of stirs the heart. But that's almost his point, that there's an extreme. There was another view of life being taught in his day that was all about love. All you need is love. And he kind of steered away from that and just talked about wisdom and good ethical practice. And it's amazing because I kept looking because I'm thinking, what would motivate millions of people to follow him when it's almost like commonsensical, right? Is that a word? Can I use that? Yeah, it's commonsensical. Not anything that's just, dramatic or deep or really raising the eyebrows. So I'll give you a few examples of some of his teachings. Confucius said, and if you read the Analects, that's where that phrase comes from. Like almost every verse just starts with those two words. Confucius said, and then you have the quote, okay? Is not he a true philosopher who, though he be unrecognized, cherishes no resentment? What you do not wish done to yourself, do not do to others. I will not grieve that others do not know me. I will grieve that I do not know others. Do not wish for quick results, nor look for small advantages. If you seek quick results, you will not attain the ultimate goal. If you are led astray by small advantages, you will never accomplish great things. Nobler persons first practice what they preach, and afterwards preach according to their practice. If when you look into your heart, you find nothing wrong there, what is there to worry about? What is there to fear? All good things, right? I like that. We'll go on. Here's another one Confucius said. When you know a thing, to recognize that you know it. And when you do not know, to know that you do not know. This is knowledge. I like that a lot. I resemble that remark. I mean, honestly, I think there's some humor, but certainly the word humor and the word humility is the same. There's a humble heart in me that says, sometimes when I'm driving over here, I'll pray to God, Lord, I can't believe I'm going to be part of a class that I'm in charge of, that I'm the teacher. I mean, I know so little. Anyhow, there's some humility in his teachings. I'll go on. Another one Confucius said, to go too far is as bad as to fall short. In that little phrase, I'm going to repeat it, but I want you to hear sort of a summary of Confucian thought. That we've heard this from other religions, by the way. It's a good thing. There must be a universal truth in it. There's a middle way. And going too much in one direction or the other, you fall into extremes, and a lot of bad things happen. But I'll read it again. Confucius said, to go too far is as bad as to fall short. So again, he taught this middle way, the wisdom way, and that's common among many religions. When you see someone of worth, Confucius said, think of how you may emulate. When you see someone unworthy, examine your own character. What strikes me about that, I remember a wise teacher once saying, careful of the plank in your own eye before you try to remove the speck out of your brother's eye. Yes, right? So there's wisdom. I'll go on. Confucius said, wealth and rank are what people desire, but unless they be obtained in the right way, they may not be possessed. Feel kindly toward everyone, but be intimate only with the virtuous. All good things. He had a philosophy based on common sense, practical wisdom, no elaborate deity system, rather stark on the stage among other great religions, I think. But when answering questions about heaven and God and things like that, Confucius was known to kind of quickly bring attention to matters back down on earth. So in other words, you could say this is a very this world focused type of religion. I'm going to go over a few key terms. Don't try to write them down. You'll have these on the handout next week. Jin, or in our letters, it would be Jen. Jin could be translated goodness or human-heartedness, elevating human dignity by combining respect for oneself and one another on the interpersonal level primarily, how we treat one another. This quality of feeling involves compassion towards humanity, towards others. At the same time, a healthy respect for oneself is embedded in this, all about elevating human dignity. In our language today, I know from psychology, some people will use this phrase, be your best authentic self. If that lands with you, the best authentic self. That is, it's a little bit trite to say be all you can be or be your best, but that's really the goal. It's also similar to the golden rule in terms of do unto others. That would be likened in this particular quality, characteristic, or concept. Chunzu is another one, and again, I'm quick to say, forgive me, I cannot pronounce and have really needed some help to even spell some of these terms, but Chunzu would be C-H-U-N, the next word, T-Z-U, humanity at its best. When someone in our language might say, be the bigger person, not a superiority mindset, but being that best elevated human being, and doing so elevates all of society. So like on a societal level, when we are being the best that we can be, best humans that we can be, all of our humanity is elevated. So it might be closer to the concept how we talk in Christianity, like hospitality, being a servant to others, rather than a self-focus, what's in it for me, if that helps. Li is another concept, L-I, li. Propriety is one English word that might help, or etiquette. It's the way things ought to be done. Like other religions, this quality strives for a middle way between these extremes that I've mentioned in order to bring about balance and harmony between people. Now, another sense of the word li, L-I, is ritual. Ritual. Again, I owe a debt of gratitude to Houston Smith. You've heard me mention his book quite a bit, World's Religions. He says, I quote, "The individual's entire life becomes a stylized sacred dance." So when we think about when we do things right, L-I, it's this idea, and I love Smith's phrase, a stylized sacred dance. Social life has been choreographed. Its basic steps have been worked out, leaving little need for improvisation. So it's a way of life, this Confucianism. It's a way of life that's given to people. You don't have to make things up as you go along. You can just follow the dance steps. All right, another dance step or concept or sacred term, te, T-E, te. Literally meaning power, particularly the power by which people are ruled. But that was not Confucius' way. I mean, he was living in a time where force, overexertion of force and violence against people was not helping, right? It does not serve. So I wanted to share a story with you because the middle way that Confucius promoted was not the way that all you need is love, kind of universal love will cure all our problems, or it's not brute force either, because there was a very popular way of living, in fact, going back to the Qin dynasty, which is where we derive the name China. It was really all about use of force to keep people in line. Well, this is one of the best known stories. Again, I'm quoting Houston Smith telling the story. One of the best known of all Confucian stories is of how on the lonely side of Mount Tai, he heard the mourning wail of a woman. Asked why she wept, she replied, "My husband's father was killed here by a tiger, my husband also, and now my son has met the same violent fate." "Then why do you dwell in such a dreadful place?" Confucius asked. "Because here there is no oppressive ruler," the woman replied. "Never forget," said Confucius, "that an oppressive ruler is more cruel than a tiger." So, I mean, his teachings were trying to help people find a way that didn't resort to violence and government oppression by means of overuse of force. Now, another word, when. Again, I may not be saying these things right. W-E-N in our transliteration. It's the arts of peace, including what we may call today the arts and humanities, when you study at a college, for example. It's in contrast to the popular Sun Tzu art of war, right? These are the arts of peace, multiple arts, meaning poetry, art, music, the sum total of all aesthetic culture. Our Bible says, whatever is beautiful, whatever is true, think on these things. So it's that same idea of exalting what is excellent. And the most exalted culture will last. Quote, "The moral character of a society constitutes its excellence." So that's the idea of the arts of peace. And finally, for my talk, I mean, this is just a very basic intro, trying to lift up some of the very best. Tien, T-I-E-N, if you're writing it down. Tien is the highest will of heaven. And again, Confucius didn't talk about heaven, but certainly people do, right? And people before him and after him believe in various gods. And the idea of there is an overarching heaven or a place where our loved ones are gathered and our ancestors still exist, right? This concept may have come actually from among the folk religions of China, but the overall concept is that there is a divine guidance or a will of heaven, Tian, to use that phrase, a will of heaven. There's an absolute universal power similar to the Tao. Now, we're going to talk about Taoism next week, Tao, T-A-O, or some say Tao. I'm probably going to use those two interchangeably, the pronunciations at least, but I'm talking about ancient Eastern religion, T-A-O, or Taoism. And so this has a place where those two, Confucius and Taoism, meet with this idea of a will of heaven or an absolute universal power. Some religions have called it fate, so we might have a sense of it from that in the background of Greco-Roman religions. that we're more familiar with here in the West. But it's certainly the realm of our dearly departed ancestors. We might simply just say heaven. Wanted to share with you the 5 relationships. This is important. Again, I'll give you this handout next week. That to understand Confucianism is you've got to understand a web of relationship and your responsibility and your role in each one of these 5 constant relationships. The relationship between parent and child, husband and wife, elder sibling to junior sibling, elder friend to junior friend, ruler and subject. So there's a hierarchy here, right? Parent to child. Each one of these, one is higher than the other, and it's incumbent upon the person in the higher social position to show love and compassion, and the one in the lower social position in these relationships to show respect and submission or obedience. So all these things kind of go together, but this is how Confucianism works, is that when people do their very best to be, the best human beings they can be, and in their role and responsibility in each of these constant relationships, then society works better. When those things break down, can you even imagine a culture where respect for relationships breaks down, where the institution of marriage, for example, is just breaking down? Yes, we understand how these things can be, or no respect for authority or others. Yeah, we can understand when relationships break down. But here's the genius. So I'm kind of coming to a conclusion. I know it's amazing if you think that I'm going to talk for less than an hour. Don't worry, I still have time to think of something. But I'm kind of coming to a focused point here, that there is a genius to Confucius' answer to societal problems, particularly the problem of unrest, violence, and the breakdown of customs. His way forward is a unique creative tension between tradition and renewal of tradition. So it's like, yes, venerate the ancient wisdom, and at the same time keep it fresh. And so his writings and his sayings really arrived on the world stage at a time where that was particularly needed and ready for wide acceptance. It's simple yet so effective, and over time, quickly, it became the de facto state religion of China. That secret sauce, or that special genius, as I've mentioned, was to find this middle way of wisdom and practical ethics for every person on every level to practice, to follow, in order to keep peace and harmony, and to shun the more popular extremes. One was universal love. The other extreme was, particularly from the government side, brute force. Or if you were a landowner, you felt not only was it okay to use force against your neighbor, but that was expected. So he found this middle way. That was the genius. It's all about being fully human, is another way to describe Confucianism. About being fully human. We might use another psychological term like self-actualization. But we would have to add to that, being fully human, being all that you can be, you must fully love your neighbor as yourself, and to live in peace and harmony on every level of your constant relationships, both interpersonal and on the societal level. So basically, it's a wisdom tradition influencing societal norms for centuries. It's all good, a lot of good things here. And I lift this up because if you're looking at it more like a philosophy, or almost a generic religion, if you will, don't place it in the negative. So that's one thing I hope to do as I present each of these religions, is so often they get, particularly from the Western mindset, they kind of get a bum rap. I don't read into Confucianism that it is at all fatalistic. It's actually rather hopeful. It is not pessimistic. It is actually very forward-looking. It's a religion that invites you to be active, to have agency, which is really important because in contrast to the time that we live in right now, even in a very Christianized nation, we have a generation of people, or 2 generations, I might say, who live without hope, who think the future is going to be awful and today is not hardly worth living. So in his time of violence and unrest, Confucius was actually able to translate hopefulness, human action that makes a difference, and so we all can want something like that. So in closing, I would love to lift up some more notable Confucian leaders that deserve mention, but quite honestly, in all humility, my language limitations truly preclude this. One that I can pronounce and write down, and it'll be on your handout next week, is Mencius. Mencius was known as the second sage. Again, not chronologically, just second in importance only to Confucius. He codified Confucius' teachings and brought them again out on the public stage about 200 years after Confucius' life. He added to it, teaching that human nature is basically good. And so the work of Mencius helped to keep Confucianism central in Chinese society and to spur on its longevity. It's certainly worth naming Mencius, and you can look him up and find some of those writings as well. Again, I wish I could do more in a setting like this, presentations on other religions and everything. I know I'm going to fall short, but I want to give you some familiarity, share with you my impressions as I'm learning right alongside with you, and certainly try to honor your time. So in conclusion, I'm going to say this, and I'm going to give a tip of the hat to a book by Jason Boyett, The 12 Religions of the World. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but basically this comes from Jason Boyett. Today's China officially recognizes 5 religions: Buddhism, Taoism, Roman Catholics, Protestant Christians, and Islam. Did you raise an eyebrow like I did when I read that? I thought, well, wait a minute. I had to read it again. Did I miss Confucius, right? Confucianism, where is it? Well, it does not recognize that officially right now. The rise of the 20th century, communism and other governmental developments have suppressed it. And knowledge of it is no longer required for government employees. So it used to be kind of taught in the primary schools, in the home, in the official education, if you will. And then for government work, you had to kind of pass a civil servants exam on Confucianism, but it's not official now. Very few Chinese people today identify as Confucians. Interestingly, a Chinese person today may practice elements of a variety of these. She may practice ancestor veneration, seek harmony with the Tao, and rely on Buddhist burial practices. All of this without blinking an eye, not giving any thought to the differences of these religions. And I thought, wow, that's the world we live in. Because ultimately, when we get towards the end of this whole course, I think we'll find that Christianity, and what we think of as our religion, has actually had a lot of others poured into it. And just by virtue of language, okay? And that doesn't dilute it, doesn't make it bad. I'm just saying, it's very interesting to think about how people live and believe, which helps me to think about how I live, think, and believe. So hopefully that's helpful. Oh, one question I anticipated. I didn't write this down, so I'm shooting from the hip, but you're used to that. You've heard preachers before, right? There is, just in terms of understanding, you kind of have to make some points of congruence here. So there is no official worship. In my Christianity, certainly worship is central, but people do basically venerate Confucius. There may be home shrines, but there's certainly temples, like in his hometown is probably the biggest temple, and they'll have a big gathering on his birthday. But it's not religion like regular worship or prayer, and there is no monastic order, which is interesting. So there's no priests, there's no monks or nuns or anything like that, which you do find in Buddhism, even though there's not a deity, which, is very interesting, just interesting stuff. But that's what I've got for Confucius. I hope that helps, and I will take questions. I just don't know if I have any more answers. About this. I've got answers. I've got words to share. But again, contact me online if you want the information.